speak in the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for coming here this morning and joining us. And if you're joining us online, I know it must look different if you're sitting at home and you see that we're not really in church. We're in the fellowship hall. I made a note to myself that I wish that I had encouraged somebody to bake bread in the kitchen this morning. It would have been wonderful with the message I'm going to preach to have the smell of fresh bread coming from the kitchen as you arrived at church. It kind of reminds me of the first time I ever went to the Middle East. I got on an El Al airplane in New York City, and the minute you get on El Al, you have arrived in Israel, because you get to the door of the plane and you're hit with the smell of fresh bread that's being baked on the plane. And so you really do have this sense of arriving in Israel before you even leave New York City. So today, I want to talk about bread. This food of steadfast love is sort of the working title of what I wanted to talk about today. Today, in churches around the world, there'll be the celebration of what is known as the Feast of the Transfiguration. And we could have done that today too and changed our readings, but I thought we would stay the course since we have been working our way through all the parables to this moment in the Gospel of Matthew. It's a day to celebrate the transfiguration of Jesus up on the mountain in the smoke. And it's not very far from the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee where the Mount of Transfiguration is. But our gospel reading today takes place at the foot of the mountain, in the foothills. Imagine that. Here we are in the foothills of North Carolina. So maybe this message will hit you in a different way. We've had these parables about sowing and treasure and yeast and mustard seed and pearls. Well, everybody got hungry. They've been listening to all this and they wanted to eat. And we're told there were 5,000, not counting women and children. That's a lot of people. It is. And Jesus takes just a little bit of food. I've heard a sermon where they say that Jesus took a little boy's lunchbox. I've heard a whole sermon about the lunchbox of a little boy fed 5,000. This idea that an ordinary meal, a couple of fish, and a few loaves of bread were enough for Jesus to take. And they call it the miracle of the multiplication. 5,000 plus women and children. And everybody ate, and there were baskets left over that were taken up. It's an amazing miracle story. And just as it says on the front of your bulletin today, have a look at the front of your bulletin, that image. It says, all ate, and all were filled. All ate, and all were filled. 5 loaves and 2 fish. A great miracle story of the gospel. A little bit of trivia. This is the only one of it's the only one that appears in all 4 Gospels, this story of the miracle of multiplication. So of all the miracle stories that we have in the Gospel, this is one that appears in all 4, the only one. I think that's important. It actually appears twice in Matthew. Mark has a slight variation of the story. So think about that. Of all the miracles in the whole Bible, in the New Testament, this is the one that shows up in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's a big story. It's an important story because I think the message behind the story is one that is not to be missed. Now let me see if I can make the case for the defense. Where is this place where the miracle of the multiplication happened? The fancy name is called Tabgha. Tabgha. If you were to go there today, you would see road signs to Tabgha. And there at Tabgha, you're on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. You're about 50-minute drive north of Tiberias. You're where the Sea of Galilee starts turning the corner in the top western corner of the Sea of Galilee. You've just passed Nazareth on your left. So you're thinking about going up the interstate. If we're like I-95. The exit to Nazareth is just before the exit to Tabgha. But Nazareth is going west up into the hills. where Mary lived, where her well was, where the Lord came and spoke to her and said, you'll have a child. That's over here. But if we turn this way, we arrive at this little place called Tabgha on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's just sort of a rocky, shelly shore. It's not sandy beach. And there in this ordinary place, all of these people gathered. And remember, the Mount of the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, that's just up the hill from there. The Mount of the Transfiguration, just up the hill. We're right in the heart of the gospel of Jesus here. This is also the same place. If you jumped ahead to the Gospel of John, and around the 20th, 21st chapter, you get the early resurrection appearances of Jesus. The disciples were walking along the shore, and they saw someone cooking fish. That is the same place as this church, Tabgha. So isn't it something that the place where he fed 5,000 people is the same place where he appeared to the disciples after the resurrection? It's an important part of the story. Now, recently, there's a bit of a sad chapter to report. In 2015, some very fundamentalist, extreme people, some would call them settlers, who live there, who are very anti-Christian. They're radicals. They firebombed the church in Tabgha. There's lots of reported, there's a person in jail now who was found guilty, tried for desecrating and destroying this church. He didn't destroy it all, but he burned the roof, and it was a horrible, horrible fire. There was a lot of destruction there. There have been over 50 hate crimes since 2015 against the Christian church in Israel. So the idea that persecution has somehow stopped, it's probably worth us remembering that the Christian church is still persecuted in parts of the world. And today, there is a church there that has been rebuilt. And I made a note to myself, 1,623 years after it was originally built, they built it back. Just goes to show you that churches face adversity. Churches face things that break. Churches face fires that burn the roof. Churches face air conditioners that stop working. And yet, the church is resilient because the people of God come together and miracles happen. The earliest building there at Tabgha is a little chapel. It was built around 350. 350. And the reason it was built there, and I put a bunch of historical notes, but basically the Emperor Constantine became a Christian. And Constantine sent a scholar there and said, we need to rediscover all these holy sites from the Bible. And so they built this little chapel. And in that chapel, there's a spectacular mosaic floor which survived the fire. And it's a beautiful, beautiful telling of the story of the miracles in tile on the floor, an ancient floor, that tourists still today, there'll be tourists there today visiting this church in Tabgha. I made a note to myself that King Herod had feasts all the time at the time of Jesus, but his feasts were private galas for the rich, for the powerful. His feast simply led to death. And Jesus has a feast, a miracle, a feeding of the 5,000, a giant picnic for the poor and the oppressed and the outcast, a meal that leads to life. And I made a note, I said, which party would I like to attend? I know which one I would like to attend. Herod's may have had better music and better seats, but Jesus had a feast that would fill you where you would never be hungry again in a spiritual way. And so every time we come together as the people of God, we reenact this picnic, this miracle story, the feeding of the 5,000. We're here today in the downstairs fellowship hall of the education building to reenact the miracle story that took place on the Sea of Galilee, which is also a foreshadowing of the miracle of the Last Supper that took place, where Jesus took bread and broke it before he was crucified. It all ties together. The whole story ties us together. And just like on that day, Jesus takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he shares it with everyone who's hungry. There's no questions asked of you who gather here today. Your outstretched hands are enough to receive the bread from heaven. And Jesus continues to call each of us to take the blessings from God, to break them open, and to share them with the world. Jesus is calling us to come to the party, a party where no one leaves hungry, where there's bread for everyone, joy and life for all. The first time I went to Tabga, and I walked in this church, and it's small. It's actually about the same size as this room. And I stood in front of that mosaic floor, and I was just transfixed by these animals and other things, and to think how old this floor was. And then I worked around the side up closer to the altar. And the altar was very small, very special. And I looked on the floor beneath the altar. And beneath the altar, the part of the mosaic which jumped out at me was this: the loaves and the fishes in the mosaic tiles beneath this little altar in this little church on the shore. But I was confused, and I asked my wonderful Palestinian historian who was with me, I said, but wait a minute, I know my Bible. The Bible says that the little boy had 5 loaves and 2 fish. This mosaic only has 4 loaves and 2 fish. Somebody made a mistake. And he said, oh no, Father, there's no mistake. The 5th loaf is the one that's on top of the altar, which we will break and share today. My mind was blown. I went to the gift shop immediately and bought this and brought it back from Tabga. Probably made in China, I don't know. But I don't care, because it reminds me to keep taking the loaf that God provides, to keep breaking it, and to keep sharing it. And that's what I've been doing ever since I got back. This miracle still lives today. You could argue that Jesus didn't just feed 5,000 and women and children, but he's still feeding a hungry world this morning. If only we would look around us, if only we would reach our hands out and take the bread that is extended to us. If only. I heard an old story about a factory worker who, pretty stubborn guy, and he spent 24 years estranged from his family, working real hard, struggling through life. And then one day a man in a suit showed up at the factory, and he called out his name, and he went in the office to see him, and he said, I just wanted to let you know that you've just inherited $19 million. And he said, I've been struggling all this time. Your mother and father have died, and now all that money is yours. He knew nothing about his inheritance because he chose never to go back home. He failed to stay in touch. His estrangement caused him to live a life of poverty and struggle. Now, it's a simplistic kind of story. I don't want to overanalyze a little story. But in many ways, God calls us to stay connected to him in our lives. We can stay estranged from God. There's so many people that just aren't interested anymore. They've given up on the faith. They live lives where they feel self-sufficient. I don't really need the church. And God says, come take this bread into your life. Why wait 24 years for a man in a suit to show up and say, hey, by the way, you've inherited it all? The good news is we know that we inherit it all today. And God calls us to come with outstretched arms, to receive this bread of heaven. So the only thing left to do is to remind you of the words of an old hymn. I bet many of you, do you remember the hymn, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah? I guess they changed the words to Great Redeemer or something. The chorus in that seems to be a fitting way to finish this message today. That chorus that says, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. May Almighty God fill us, sustain us, redeem us. May we find joy in our inheritance as we live until that day when we join all the saints in the great feast in heaven, surrounded by angels and archangels and all the company of heaven who shall rejoice. We shall be full then. And the people said, Amen.
Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this fair